I just have been thinking about this for a long time based on my own experiences as a recovering physical educator, as I mentioned, somebody who has a background in athletics and somebody who came through medicine through my interest in exercise physiology. So I just ask, how many people here think that they're an elite doctor? And only Dr. Friedhoff raised his hand. So let's just kind of review that and see, work our way through a few things. So why this topic? Well, I would argue that you are an elite performers and you're not part of an industrial workforce generating a product. I would also argue that there are parallels in what we do with sport, music, theater, and those are more relevant than the industrial analogies. And the question is, what can we learn from the relevant parallels? Now, we all hope that the following last bullet point would be true, but I don't think that there's any tech-driven, automated, optimized, frictionless world out there waiting for us. And I think if we've learned anything in the last few years, maybe that's one of the take-home messages. So elite performers have talent. How many people in here have talent? At least a couple of you, good. How many of you have undergone a rigorous, competitive, and critical selection process? Well, we'll get more hands now. How many of you have undergone prolonged training with plenty of feedback and evaluation? More people. I guess one person here is not being evaluated. For Dr. Friedhoff and Dr. Wilder back in the back of the room, how many people are increasingly seeking to extend their career? And as we think about burnout, how many of us are subject to overtraining and overuse injuries? Probably quite a few. So does this seem at all familiar? Now let's think about elite performance organizations, teams. They win with people. They master the fundamentals. They communicate clearly. They understand innovation, and we'll get to that later. They practice workload management. And they practice distributed leadership. Now, the two yellow things have a lot of overlap with the material I mentioned for the elite performers. The elite performers also master the fundamentals, and they also practice workload management. So how about talent ID and selection? What do we learn about talent ID and selection from elite athletic performance? There's talent ID via standardized testing. How many people here have taken standardized tests? There are social networks and exposure. You know, if you don't think you're ever going to become a doctor, you're not going to become a doctor. Perhaps if you know somebody, if there's a mentor, if there's somebody who encourages you, if you think, hey, this would be pretty cool, you might do it. And then there's also real world performance, how you do in the classroom, how you do in the lab, how you do it here, how you do there. And sometimes real world performance belies what we've learned from talent ID and standardized testing. I'll give you an example. This is what they did in the United Kingdom when they became concerned that as a one-time rowing power, the United Kingdom used to win all the medals in rowing. They stopped winning them. So what did they do? They said, well, what do we know about good rowers? They're tall, they're physically fit, and there's a lot of medals available in the women's category, and it's perhaps underdeveloped in our country. So they went to all the universities and colleges, to the fitness centers, and said, if you're tall, if you're physically fit and you like to work out, come get tested. And through that, they found a whole bunch of people who became great rowers, like Helen Glover on the left, who's won multiple gold medals. And in fact, 40% of the UK rowing team has come through talent identification. It hasn't come from Oxford and Cambridge and the traditional routes. So if you cast a wide net, you can sometimes do better. Now, how many people think you need a muscle biopsy or you need a genetic test or some sort of blood test to understand who's going to be elite versus a real performance test? Just like us, real performance on the wards, in the ORs, wherever we are. How many people vote for a lab test or a muscle biopsy? How many people vote for a real world test? Who votes for the real world test? Good. Well, this is a woman named Anna Mears. And she was identified through a talent ID program in rural Australia as somebody who was quite powerful, and she became one of the great track cyclists of all times. This is, I think, a 42-inch box, and she's about 5'4". And she's doing it repeatedly. So once they saw that she could do things like this, they thought, wow, you know, maybe this woman could be good at something that required a lot of power. Everybody knows how to ride a bike, and they got her on the cycling team and really trained her up, and she won multiple medals. Now, how about biases? You know, people think we know what elite sprinters look like, right? If we know what elite sprinters look like, these guys don't look like a bunch of Jamaicans, do they? So we have to check our biases when we think about talent ID, because talent comes in strange places and unusual places. And if we cast a wider net, we'll do better, which is exactly what the Japanese have done. Mr. Cambridge on the right is half Japanese, half, I think, Jamaican. But the three other individuals are full-blooded Japanese. So that is kind of interesting here. And most people would not believe this if you just said how many medals in the relays have the Japanese won, the sprint relays. Now, what also about our biases? How many people think that high jumpers are tall? They tend to be pretty tall, 6'2", 6'3", 6'4", 6'5", 6'6", right? And so we could say, well, we're only going to recruit people, do talent ID with tall people. But if you don't pay attention to the real world, you may miss some very talented people. Like this man, Franklin Jacobs, back from my era. Here's 5'7" Franklin Jacobs, jumping 7'7". Mr. Jacobs still holds the world record for jump over his head, highest distance over his head. So again, we want to cast a wide net. We want to do talent ID. We want to use real world tests, and we don't want to exclude people in a crazy way. Now, why has the United States dominated the last two Olympics? Title IX, women. More than half the medals have been won by women. And that's strictly because we embed sports in the high schools and colleges. And you can, had the women competed as a separate country, they would rank third in the overall medal chart behind China and Britain, just ahead of the American men. And that happened again last summer at Tokyo. So again, diversity works if you want to win. How about training? I'm not going to say a whole lot about this. This is a very famous race, the 1964 Olympic 5,000 meter finals. You can see there were still dirt tracks in those days. And you can see that these three men, Bob Schul, Harold Norpoth, and Bill Dellinger, finished very closely. Dellinger just nipping out Michel Jazy of France with the great Kip Keino, one of the first two great East African runners of all time. And now, how many people think that these individuals had similar training programs? How many people think they trained differently? They trained very differently. Mr. Schul did what we would call high intensity exercise all day, every day. Essentially, very rarely ran farther than 200 or 300 or 400 meters at a time, but he ran it fast. Norpoth ran sometimes 200 miles a week slowly, and Dellinger did mixed training. So, but they all had one thing in common, or several things in common. They ran a lot of miles. They ran some of them faster than their race pace, and they rested once in a while. This is something called the running haiku, which I came up with. And you can come up with haikus for all sorts of things that describe what successful people do, and typically simply boil it down to 2 or 3 or 4 factors. And as the talk continues, as it progresses, we're going to talk more about the need to simplify and not confuse ourselves and not distract ourselves. Now, for the senior members of the delegation, how many people here want to have longer careers? Well, who are the masters of longer careers? Tom Brady and a woman named Dara Torres. We all know about Tom Brady. Dara Torres has slipped from our minds a little bit. But in 2012, at age, I think 45 or 46, she got a medal in the sprint swimming events. So how many people think that Tom Brady has a secret formula? Let's keep going. How many people think, okay, there we go. We got a skeptic in the back there that thinks Mr. Brady. Well, according to The Guardian, he's on an alkaline diet. He practices something called muscle pliability. He believes that hydration can prevent sunburns, and he has special bioceramic pajamas. All right, now you drill down on all this, and you drill down on this with Dara Torres as well. And you drill down on this on anybody who's continued to do well as they get older. And you find out that they're consistent, they train consistently, they get sleep and they recover. They're on some sort of restricted diet. There's nothing special about the restricted diet. It just stops middle-aged weight gain. That's it. Just reduces food choices, stops middle-aged weight gain. They've avoided catastrophic injuries, and for some reason, they've been able to stay motivated. And with some of these individuals, you have to think it's way more than the money, because they have more than they could ever spend. They have, far more than anybody could spend in several lifetimes. And remember this, adherence really matters. And this is one of my favorite slides. This is all diets work if followed. So this is, this diet's better than that diet, whatever. But this is the Atkins diet versus the Zone diet versus the Weight Watchers diet versus the Ornish diet. And you can see on the right, there's a dietary adherence score. And the dietary adherence score, we can move that a little bit, shows you that if the dietary adherence is high, people lose 20 kilograms. And it doesn't matter which diet they're on. And the relationship is the same for all diets. So now what happens? This is the great Gary Player. What happens when somebody adheres their whole life? Gary Player is a great golfer. He's currently 86 and occasionally shoots 68. Yeah, exactly, right. And one of the things that's interesting about Mr. Player is that he was one of the first skill athletes to strength train. He's paid close attention to his diet for his entire life. And he's a kind of an exercise nut. So here he is at age 82, 4 years ago, still hitting the ball about 250 yards off the tee. And I want to ask, as you watch this, who in the room has a better swing? And I see Dr. Nard just showed it. He may have a better swing. Now you can watch Jack Nicklaus be barely able to get up to the tee here. So that's what happens when you adhere your whole life to these principles. Now you win with people. That's the other thing I think that elite organizations certainly understand. And I want to talk a little bit about that. This is Grace Hopper. She's a U.S. admiral and was the first female admiral, I believe. And she was a computer pioneer, came up with one of the early computer programming languages. And she said, you manage things, you lead people. We went overboard on management and forgot about leadership. How many people here are basketball fans? Anybody remember who Chuck Daly was? Chuck Daly coached the Dream Team. And he also won at the University of Pennsylvania. So how do you win in the NBA with the Dream Team and the Ivy League? So he went everywhere he was. And he had a lot of insights about coaching people. Here he is with the great Michael Jordan prior to the Barcelona Olympics. He made a few comments about working with super talented people. Again, elites like yourself. One, he pointed out it's a players' league. He pointed out leadership of talented people is selling. You have to constantly sell them on your vision and your program. He pointed out that leaders generate followers. And then one of the most amazing things he said is that leaders need to learn to ignore. Now, what do you think that means? Any ideas? What does learn to ignore mean? No ideas. What's that? Move on. Yeah, get over it. Well, the story is that Mike Krzyzewski, the coach at Duke, who has just retired, winning his college coach ever, was the assistant on the Dream Team, and Krzyzewski was taking notes at practice. Daly went to Krzyzewski and said, Michael, what are you doing? He said, Coach, I'm taking notes so that we can go over what the mistakes, go over the things that need correction after practice with the players. Daly grabbed the clipboard, tore up the paper and said, Michael, if you're going to coach these guys, you're going to have to learn to do one thing really well. And he said, what's that, Coach? You're going to have to learn to ignore. He goes, if there's a major problem, we'll deal with it. Otherwise, leave them alone. And that takes a lot of courage to do. And interestingly, he also said, I'd rather have a difficult team. He had a lot of interesting characters, including Dennis Rodman, who he never had a problem with, partly because he ignored, but partly he felt that people who were difficult wanted to win and cared. And he said that you can have a lot of nice people, but sometimes they don't care. So I think that's the other thing to remember is that sometimes I think we get a little conflict averse in our environment. And sometimes maybe we'd all be better off with a difficult team. Now, how about master the fundamentals? How many people here believe we should master the fundamentals? And this is where we're going to get to a whole bunch of things related to complexity and simplification. So the stages of consciousness, competence, we have unconscious incompetence, we have conscious incompetence. How many of the residents and trainees think that they're, certainly the beginners are probably in conscious incompetence? How about conscious competence? The more senior people may be there. We can potentially get to unconscious competence where we just do things. And then you can get to mastery, the ability to effortlessly find solutions to novel challenges. So it just looks like you're making it up, but in reality, you're mixing and matching skill sets you've mastered to do novel things. So how do you get to mastery? Any ideas? Mr. Gladwell is right to some extent, but wrong in some ways. So let's look at Benny Goodman, the great jazz clarinet player. He was a pioneer. He had an integrated band. He practiced each morning for several hours. What do you think he practiced? Scales, fingering drills. And he took lessons throughout life. Think about that. Considered the greatest, and he still took lessons. My mother knew his niece. And his niece told me one time that he was the nicest man in the world unless you interrupted his practice. And he said, just don't bother him from 8:30 to 10:30 in the morning. And then you could do whatever you wanted. So I think that's sort of interesting as well. How about Johan Cruyff? Johan Cruyff, anybody know who Johan Cruyff is? Great soccer player, Dutch soccer player, later became a great coach. And he came up with this quote, football is simple, playing simple football is hard. And we'll come back to that later. And if you look at what people have in common in these team sports and think about analogies for us, angles and spacing are important. This is true with the great Soviet hockey teams, Cruyff, Wayne Gretzky, Magic Johnson, who said famously when they asked him how he could make so many no-look passes, 90%, 95, 99% of his no-look passes, he said, because I can make 100% of the look passes. Simple offenses with reads. We'll talk about Vince Lombardi and John Wooden. Now, some of you may not have heard or be familiar with those, but Vince Lombardi is considered the greatest coach in the National Football League. 5 titles in 10 years. John Wooden won 11 titles at UCLA in 13 years. The University of Connecticut women do the same thing. So they simplify their offenses, get smart players, give the players reads. This can be mastered and taught with individual and team drills. Herb Brooks, a great hockey coach who coached the Dream Team in 1980 and was for many years the coach at the University of Minnesota, showed that you could take above average college hockey players and through a series of drills, teach them about angle spacing and how to exploit the weaknesses of the opponents and develop an adaptive approach to playing hockey, which again, can we develop an adaptive approach to medicine, an adaptive approach to the challenges we see in the operating rooms or in the ICUs? I say we can if we master the fundamentals. Now, Vince Lombardi and John Wooden both started as junior high teachers. They had long roads to success. They didn't become successful until they were in their later 40s or early 50s. Both felt they were poor game coaches, so they had to prepare and make things as automatic as possible for their teams. Both had very simple playbooks, as I mentioned before. The Green Bay Packers had 8 plays. They had 8 plays. That's it. If you read the story of Lombardi's preparation for a game, he spent the entire week removing plays from the game plan with his Hall of Fame quarterback, Bart Starr. Both were obsessed with the fundamentals down to adjusting people's footwork at practice. They both had short practices, feeling that if you had a simple offense and a simple game plan, you didn't need to burn people out by practicing too much. Practice a few things over and over again. Both were way ahead on racial issues, or integrated their teams far earlier than their peers. And both, interestingly, were religious men, but both were described as religious mystics by former players because they weren't necessarily as interested in success and winning and losing as you might think, but they were interested in seeing a perfect play, seeing perfect execution, seeing their ideas come to life on the field or on the court. And you can see this great quote from Lombardi about his 8-play system. Our system is complete, simple, and comprehensive. We can attack the whole field. We have very little trickery. We really don't need it. We win with execution. Something works, not because it's a brilliant piece of strategic or tactical thinking, but because our team has practiced the same plays, the same movements, and the same fundamentals over and over and over again. So how many people here think we spend a lot of time in medicine confusing ourselves by trying to make things more complicated than they are? It's the enemy. Trust me, it's the enemy. Now, communicate clearly. This is one of the great things I like to do when I'm riding the Peloton early in the morning is watch Sports Center. And the talking heads are fantastic, including Louis Riddick, who is an excellent NFL player and is now one of the top commentators. This is about the firing of Urban Meyer. Urban Meyer was a top college coach, was known to be a bit of a tyrant and a dictator. He tried to coach the Jacksonville Jaguars, and that lasted, I think, about 6 or 8 games until he was fired. And Riddick had a lot of very interesting comments, and there's a great YouTube clip video of him talking about this. He said, you can coach people hard. He came from a different era where coaches occasionally yelled and screamed. But he said, you can't coach people hard unless you have credibility and have their trust. And there's a whole bunch of literature in coaching and teaching that says that you can be very direct with the learners or the people under your supervision, provided they think you're trying to make them better, provided they think you're trying to make them better and not ridiculing them and not demeaning them. So again, trying to make them better. So it's not about you, it's about them. And again, who are you trying to make better? So when you communicate with people, I think it's okay to be direct. And I think sometimes we're not direct enough. But I think the key thing is they have to trust you. You have to have credibility, walk the walk. And you have to clearly help let people understand that you're trying to make them better or make your group better or your team better. They have to buy into that shared vision of success. So anybody here know what the Abilene paradox is? The Abilene paradox is a story of people sitting around a house in rural Texas, and everybody is just kind of hanging around the house. And so somebody concludes that everybody is bored and doesn't want to be there anymore. Nobody said that they're bored. Nobody said a word. And somebody says, hey, let's go to Abilene. And nobody really wants to go to Abilene. People are fine sitting around the house doing whatever they're doing. But people do not want to disagree. So they say, hey, yeah, that's a great idea. Let's go to Abilene. And so everybody ends up getting in the car, going to Abilene. It's a horrible hot drive, and there's nothing to do in Abilene either. But what this is an example of people trying to guess what's in other people's minds, and then people failing to disagree and failing to voice their disagreements and say, hey, that's not the vision we need. We need to do something else. And the Abilene paradox can happen both at the local level, very small things that you happen, and can happen in large institutions and organizations as well, as people chart some course without even thinking that there's going to be issues with buy-in. And it's really results from failure to speak up, everyone trying to read everyone's mind. And it's really a hallmark of top-down leadership and an inability of people from the lower levels or the people who are receiving these ideas to say no or say, hey, wait a second. Now, how about buzzword bingo and newspeak? Right sizing equals layoffs. Special military operation equals war. Provider versus doctor or nurse. Now, why would anybody want to call us providers? Anybody have any ideas? Somebody must have thought it through. Well, and so I think, Bob, and I think it's also true because there could be some of our CRNA colleagues watching this. I think it's a question to make people generic, make them cogs in a workforce, and it's a way to subtly disrespect people, disrespect their achievements, whether they're physicians, nurses, or whatever, and the struggles they've gone through to get where they are. To describe somebody as a generic provider makes them part of a workforce instead of a performer, which is, I think, what we are, elite performers involved in a performance activity. And there are too many examples to mention, but of course, there's never any buzzwords, bingo, or newspeak at our organization, correct? Now, simple metrics. Now, we all have metrics. How many people have smartwatches of some sort or another? All right, how many people weigh themselves daily? How many people think you'll get a hell of a lot more information about your health from the bathroom scale score than you will your smartwatch? Think about it. Think about it, right? So simple metrics can matter. And now whether anybody's going to do anything about the bathroom scale score is a separate issue. But it's a powerful predictor of future health outcomes, far more powerful than anything on your wrist. Now, this is from E.F. Schumacher, who wrote a very famous book called Small is Beautiful. And this gets back to the simplicity issue. It's rather more difficult to recapture directness and simplicity than to advance in the direction of ever more sophistication and complexity. Any third-rate engineer or researcher can increase complexity, but it takes a certain flair of real insight to make things simple again. And this is the little quote I came up with that because I've been described as a maximalist, as Dr. Narr knows. And to be a maximalist, you must first be a minimalist. So you have to stop doing things. And anybody here ever read the book, The Little Prince? Raise your hand. The Little Prince was written by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, who was, among other things, besides being a children's book writer, wrote a number of novels, but set up the airmail system in South America and was a famous aeronautical engineer, died as a hero of the French resistance in World War II. And he said something very interesting about designing airplanes, of which he was expert. He said, you've achieved perfection in design, not when you have nothing left to add, but when you have nothing left to take away. Think about it. Let's understand innovation. Now, this is what high jumping used to look like. Has anybody ever seen anybody high jump that way? Just a few of us. Now, then obviously this happened. This is Dick Fosbury executing the Fosbury flop. So who invented the Fosbury flop? Any guesses? Come on, it can't be that hard. We'll get to managing your fear later in the talk. All right, who invented the Fosbury flop? Well, he co-invented it, and in fact, at the same time he invented it, there was a 13-year-old girl named Debbie Brill who had invented it in Canada at the same time. It was called the Brill Bend in Canada for many years. There she is. And remember, this was not mandated by the International Olympic Committee. There were no task forces, there were no committees, and it didn't require any IT resources. What did the development of the Fosbury flop require? Yeah, and so it was teenagers who did it, but it required coaches who were willing to learn to ignore and let people screw around at practice while they tried it. Now, why did the Fosbury flop actually happen? Because people had actually done some similar things back in the 1930s. But why did it happen? Any idea? What's that? Better landing pits. When people did things sort of like this in the 30s, landing in sawdust on your back and your neck and in sand probably wasn't a good idea. Oh, so technological centaurs, I just want to make a couple of points here. That in chess, the computer champs beat human champs. Good programs and good players beat computer champs. So the obvious question as we move forward thinking about technology in our world is how do we mix and match the two and have the human skill set and use these powerful tools we have, but also bring to the table what humans have in terms of flexibility and so forth. And remember, chess is a pretty good example of something with fixed rules, a calculable number of outcomes. There's gazillions of them, but you can calculate it. And what we're involved with are called open field problems, where there aren't necessarily fixed rules for everything that we see. Now, just a word about workload or load management. Burnout is a systems problem. We get a lot of messages about self-care, but really burnout is a systems problem. Fatigue can be cumulative. How many extreme efforts per week or per month? Most people who deal with elite athletes think maybe 5 or 6 every 2 weeks is reasonable. I'm always amazed at the pilot work rules and hour limits. People who fly airline planes are allowed to fly 1,000 hours a year, 1,000 hours a year. NBA teams in back-to-back games. The pitch count in Major League Baseball. I would just argue that medicine seems to be behind. We're much better than we once were. We have workout rules for you guys, but you really wonder what's going to come next. And you wonder, given the tremendous data on things like decision fatigue and so forth in the ICU and what we allow pilots to do, you wonder when we're going to make some changes and join kind of the evidence-based movement on load management. How about distributed leadership? Anybody know what distributed leadership is? Anybody have any ideas? Tolo, are you here? You're really smart. Talk to us. You have a business, you have an MBA or something, correct? You take your mask off for a second so we can hear you. Correct. I knew you'd have the right answer. This is Dwight Eisenhower, the architect of D-Day. And he was criticized sometimes for spending too much time visiting with the troops. He spent 30% of his time out walking around because he felt he had to be able to look the people who were going to jump out of planes into occupied France. He had to be able to look them in the eye, explain to them what they were doing, why they were doing, and why it was important. And he said there's among the mass of individuals who carry their rifles in war, a great amount of ingenuity and initiative. If men can naturally and without restraint talk to their officers, the products of their resourcefulness become available to all. Now, there's another pretty interesting example of this recently as well. This happened a couple of months ago during the NBA playoffs. Steve Kerr, the great coach of the Golden State Warriors, and a graduate like myself at the University of Arizona, got COVID unexpectedly. He turned it over to his lead assistant, Mike Brown. So Mike Brown was ready. But Warriors coach Mike Brown says Andre Iguodala and Draymond Green, his two senior players, stepped up and took over as player coaches in light of head coach Steve Kerr being ruled out in the 9th hour due to COVID. Brown said they made his job much easier. So how many of us either are prepared or have prepared ourselves or are preparing ourselves to be able to step into the breach in a situation like this and lead versus looking for a direction, asking somebody else what to do next? I think this is a skill set that we need to develop as individuals, but it has to be encouraged at the small group level, the divisional level, the department level, the institutional level. I'm not sure we do it very well here. How about fear management? We talked a little bit about fear earlier. Now, this is my friend Steve Magnus, who just published a book, a bestseller, Do Hard Things. Steve is an outstanding track coach and was an elite athlete himself. And he said, what allows people to be tough? Because we all want to be mentally tough. One, you got to have a sense of control. 2, can I make progress? 3, belonging and ownership. 4, confidence. And 5, meaning. And these, you can look at these as linked circles. You can also look at them as a bit of a pyramid. But we need to give people some sense of control. We need to give them some responsibility or ownership of their progress and allow them to belong to something bigger than themselves. They need to have the confidence that is required to do things well, and they need to have some meaning in what they do. Again, meaning means we're not part of a factory generating a product. We are professionals. We are part of a team. We are performers trying to do something beautiful. Now, who is the person who I think knows the most about this? It's a man named Bud Winter. Bud Winter was a great track coach at San Jose State University. He developed a concept called relax and win. He was training Navy fighter pilots in World War II and noticed that people who could relax while they were learning to fly and land on aircraft carriers and dogfight and so forth did better than people who got tight. So he adapted this to sports training and developed a whole bunch of form and relaxation drills. I just saw it this morning when I was watching the replay of the World Track Championships. If you watch he had a great influence on the great Jamaican sprinters. If you watch Shelley Ann Fraser-Price, who's the world champion again and has won 4 gold medals, watch her face as she comes down the track. It's expressionless. It's just floppy because there's no extra tension in her face. He coached the coach of Bolt's coach. He also coached one of my coaches, making me a track cousin of Usain Bolt. And his ideas predate zone, mindfulness, Yoda, et cetera. So really a genius of a man. And here's his key concept: demand perfection of yourself and you'll seldom attain it. Fear of making a mistake is the biggest single cause of making one. Relax, pursue excellence, not perfection. Pursue excellence and not perfection. Now, we're going to give a very famous person who was able to pursue excellence, not perfection, and really embodies the relax and win concept here next. We're going to give Michael Phelps the last word. So this is the 4x100 meter relay at Rio. The United States is behind by about a half a body length going after 50 meters of Phelps's leg. And Mr. Phelps does a lot of things well, but he is a great turner. See this person that continues underwater? Much faster to be underwater. And he comes out a half a length ahead. So again, in the critical moment, when it was required for him not to be the fastest swimmer, but the best turner, the best person underwater, and to have executed skills that he'd been perfecting since he was 8 or 9 years old, who was able to nail it? Michael Phelps. He was able to absolutely nail it because he was able to relax, focus, and do his job. So I think that these are some of the thoughts I've had over the years and really been crystallized during COVID about these sorts of things and about how we can take lessons from elite athletes and elite performers and apply them to ourselves as elite doctors. I think it first starts with a change in our mindset. We're not part of a workforce. We're not involved in an industrial activity. We are in charge of, or we're involved in a performance art, and we need to think a little bit more like artists and performers. Thank you very much. So questions.
We have one question from Mark Warner. He asked, he says, distributed leadership works. This used to play out at Mayo through committees. Future leaders could prove their leadership and adaptive skills in committees, advance to the chair or higher level committees. And it seems that Mayo is moving away from this approach to distributed leadership in the past decade, now with more officers, deans, and VPs. How do you think this fits?
So did everybody hear what Mark Warner's question was? Well, Dr. Warner points out that we used to have a lot of distributed leadership around here. And as the institution has gotten corporatized, that has vanished to some extent. And I couldn't agree more with Mark. I think doing distributed leadership sometimes is hard in the short run because you can't get to a decision as quickly. But I think when you do get to a decision, it's durable, it's sustainable, there's buy-in, and you really, Mark, avoid the Abilene paradox because people know where you're going, they know why you're going, it's been discussed. And there have been both formal and informal communications because the people on the committees, the people who are in these junior leadership roles, are able to talk to their friends, get feedback from people that in their age group and in their peer group, and it's been very helpful. I'll give you an example. When in about 1995, when I was 36 or 37 years old, relatively new on the staff, I had one of my first leadership jobs was working with a man named Colin Gorman. And Colin's in his late 80s now, and at the time was head of the Division of Endocrinology. And Colin was from Ireland and is a wonderful guy. But he pointed out to me that we have a very organized system here. We have systems and procedures. There's certain ways to do things, and so forth and so on. But he also pointed out to me that there was 5 or 10% of the Mayo Clinic operated as a black market of people trading favors, people doing things, seeing extra patients, and all sorts of things like that. And I would say that in a large, complex organization like this, you destroy the black market at your own peril.
One question that I have is, what key coaching perspectives do you think that Mayo, especially appropriate to the trainees and early career anesthesiologists?
Well, let's see if we can go back to Chuck Daly's quote here. Well, I can't get to it. Well, I think all of them. I think one is that leadership is selling, developing followerships. Daly was also a master of the fundamentals. Did not overcomplicate things. I think helping. One of the things that people have told me, even as somebody who doesn't spend a lot of time dealing with trainees, but as Dr. Mantias pointed out in my last annual review, that when I work with young people, I always say, what 3 things are we going to do well today? I remind people that they wouldn't be here if they weren't elites, if they hadn't been selected, if they hadn't been through this rigorous process overseen by Dr. Long, and that they were surrounded by competence on all sides, and we weren't going to let them kill anybody. And so they needed to relax and win, focus on doing a few things well, and not, stop the monkey mind. So I think that those are the sorts of things we could do. And I think we could do those with trainees. I think we can do it at every level of the organization, I personally think that if we go back to that quote by E.F. Schumacher, that we could spend 10 years at the institution having a strategic plan only focused on simplification and decluttering the place, and we'd be way, way far ahead.
Another question that we have from Zoom is, how do you retain your sense of individual professionalism and artistry when we're increasingly treated as interchangeable widgets?
Well, that's the whole point of the talk. And so first it starts from within, and you have to have this sense of self. I think the older people have to embed it in people. I think communications from leadership has to do this. And I think we have to be very careful about the language we use, like provider and so forth and so on. I think one of the positives of the name tags that tell people their role, especially since everybody who's a physician doesn't look like me anymore, is to remind people who's a physician. I think that's been helpful at some level. And I think we needed to continue to do things like that and foster a sense that we are in fact elite. Any other questions in the room? Dr. Nard, would you like to have the last word as senior member of the delegation? Thanks much. All right, what do we do next? Stop the share.